as opposed to other cafe times that we have, this is actually a morning cafe. So I hope everyone has brought their tea and coffee and all of the lovely morning beverages that we might have, because often we end up having them in the afternoon or the evening, I've noticed, Anna. So, which is more of our, chocolate slice and other items kind of conversation. So hopefully everyone will be all fired up for an interesting discussion. What I'll do is just screen share, and we have a couple of things that we run through just to orient people who might be new to joining us today about our Alive National Centre for Mental Health Research Translation. I'm Victoria Palmer, so I'm one of the co-directors. I'm also joined by another co-director on the screen, Michelle Banfield, who will wave, but I won't trouble her today with her voice and croakiness for saying hello. But I have the great pleasure of being the introducer alongside Julia Dray, who will also raise her hand there and just say hello, who will be monitoring your questions in the chat and helping to facilitate as we hear from Maia.
Basically, yes,
after the conversation.
Vicky, you're on mute.
There we go. I don't know how that one happened. Sorry about that. Have I been on mute the whole time?
I've just
went then. Lovely. Thank you for that. I was like, oh, that's interesting. So we're hearing from Maia Olsen today, and Maia's going to focus in on what makes meaningful engagement with people with lived experience meaningful. And today's conversation is hosted by a Lived Experience Research Collective, and I'll go into our co-leads who are part of the collective, and that's led by our co-director here, Michelle Banfield, and Julia Dray. I'm someone with lived experience, but I didn't come into my research role as a lived experience researcher, so I always find these conversations very interesting, and Michelle and I had a good chance the other day to talk about different aspects of lived experience and framing and what people are trained in. So I'm looking forward to how the discussion progresses. But before we get too far into things, I'd like to acknowledge country, and I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land, skies and waterways on which we're all meeting today, and pay my respects to elders past and present. I'm joining here from Wurundjeri land, based in Naarm in Melbourne, and I invite you to share where you're joining from also in the chat. It's a great way to learn about the different nations that we're all joining from. And we always like to start our acknowledgement of country and our presentations with just our centre artwork that was co-created for us by First Nations artist Dennis Golding. And Dennis is based in Gadigal country, but he's from Gamilaraay man. And I believe that Dennis and Phil Orcher were having conversations with myself about what the intent of the centre was, and Dennis created this piece for us called Healing from the Ground. And it's really talking about connection between mind and body to country and with country, and it talks about different places and spaces of waterholes and campsites and footprints and different human and animal trails throughout. But it's really a reminder about being connected to land, the healing processes of that, and the cultural and spiritual and emotional importance of that for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. And we acknowledge that at the moment there is a large conversation happening. Our presentation today is not about that, but we invite everyone to be thoughtful and respectful throughout all of the conversations as we lead up to our referendum in Australia. We also like to recognise that, of course, given the title of the conversation, being hosted by our Lived Experience Research Collective and being an organisation that has embedded lived experience at all levels, that we'd like to recognise lived experience within the room today, and just that we speak honourably and respectfully about ongoing distress, trauma, mental ill health, and all of the work of caring and experiences of care within that context. And as Michelle would often say in this recognition, and I'll pilfer that for today, is just to invite people to sit and reflect with any discomfort that might emerge for you about different language, about different terminology, and about different wording that you might hear, and just to think about that and reflect on it for the day and for the presentation, and have an open curiosity to asking questions as we go along. So for those who may not know, just to orient the talk, we are the Alive National Centre for Mental Health Research Translation. This is our slide on a page, which we've been very happy to put together and show our 4 major research programs across prevention across the life course, longer, healthier lives in priority populations, lived experience research collective fostering lived experience-led research and growing capabilities, and mental health care at scale. And our mission is transforming mental health and wellbeing through primary care and community action. And we operationalise our work in terms of our programs through these networks and collective actions down the bottom. So you can see we have a co-design Living Labs network that's near to 2,000 members. We have an implementation and translation network that's comprised of organisations and individuals. There's about 36 members. Our next generation research network is currently at 217. And I know Michelle will be watching closely for the Lived Experience Research Collective members at 195. We've been waiting to get to 200 for some time. And our Alive Collective, which represents general members and supporters who may not have found their way in terms of our other networks, who support the special initiative in mental health that funds the Alive National Centre through the National Health and Medical Research Council. So, as I was saying, today's talk is hosted by the Lived Experience Research Collective. The focus is on capacity building, career development pathways for lived experience researchers, including family, kin and carer researchers. And it's really a place that's very inclusive around growing expertise and sharing skills and knowledge. We hold bi-monthly gatherings to host conversations and hear about research in the centre, and also take forward the agenda of the collective. And the goal is always to strengthen and integrate lived experience within mental health and research translation activities. So membership you can see on there, about 195, close to 200, is split between 70% who are based in universities and 30% of people who come from community and industry settings where they might be undertaking a research role. So we have a wide diversity of membership, and we also have membership across the whole research higher degree continuum from master's levels through to mid and more senior research career levels. This is our National Centre's embedded lived experience research model. You can see here that the collective acts as a bridge across lived experience and is nested within the Next Generation Research Network, as well as being its own research program. The idea here is, of course, that it acts as all the scaffolding and foundation for embedding lived experience within the fabric of the centre. And you can see how our co-leads, coming up in the next slide, are also embedded across our research program activities and across the co-leadership groups of the different networks. So here's our wonderful lived experience research collective co-leads. I won't go through each of them in detail. You might see some familiar names on the screen as people start to ask questions. And you can contact people and ask for more information as you go along. And I'm sure that if any of them are on the call, they will also jump into facilitating questions as we go along as well. So we're very proud of what has been set up in the research collective and the strength that it's growing in terms of numbers, but also in terms of activities. Just to give you a little bit of an overview of where we've come from in the National Centre, we recently launched our Lost in Translation zine. This is a new zine for the mental health research sector, including all of the component parts around lived experience research. You can see the beautiful artwork on the front cover is by our Aboriginal co-design lead, Philip Orcher. I don't think Philip's on the call today because he's on leave, but he's a Gumbaynggirr man. And he put this together to reflect sort of walking two worlds and systems of structure and the fluidity of the need for individual culture. And this is a whole new look for us. We used to have a bi-monthly centre update, and we just felt there's a real gap in the system and in the sector for conversations around mental health research translation and what's needed. We're also launching, in conjunction with the zine, our podcast produced by Alan Bro, a local comedian known to us in Australia, mostly through a music show called Speaks and Specs. But we're very excited that Alan will be co-hosting with Phil the podcast series, also titled Lost in Translation, and we've got some exciting things coming around that. And we invite you to scan that QR code and sign up to join some of the university activities that might be underway. So these activities will be happening in World Mental Health Month. We'll have the launch on World Mental Health Day. We also then excitingly announced our Next Generation Research Network funding scheme. So we have a number of different seed funding opportunities and invite you to check those out on the digital website pages. And we also have a special presentation and panel at the end of the World Mental Health Month at Melbourne Town Hall, looking at creative arts as an antidote to existential despair. So that panel is accompanied by Alan Bro, Beth Driscoll and Donna Lyon, who are all fantastic creatives who will be reflecting on Chris's conversation for that presentation. And that is hybrid as well. Check out the zine if you need to go and find all the links, because there you will find how to sign up for everything in the one sort of stop shop place. A number of virtual cafes are also coming in November. Special event with Rob Mills on men's health and prevention at the end of November, and our usual quarterly forum where our members come together to hear about our research activities. And we're working very, very hard towards our symposium at ANU in Canberra on holistic formations in March next year. So just to flag and contextualise just before I introduce Maia to come through and share with us much more about meaningful lived experience engagement, we have our flagship project that I think it surpassed 135 contributions, Michelle, very nodding there, very exciting. So this is our flagship project that runs for many years, but has started with a survey and really asking people for a good start to share how people may be using their lived experience to inform research practice, sharing principles, frameworks, and other things that might be used in that practice. So you don't need to share your name for that, but we're very excited to uncover more about the who, where, and what and how of lived experience research nationally. That will then flow into additional activities around the long conversation and a different range of outputs, and also inform the strategic development of our national strategy for lived experience in mental health research. And you can just see along the way, there's a timeline for that development. I won't go into all of that right now because we're all here to hear the presentation from Maia, but just noting there's a number of different ways and events that we've been focused on that are all contributing to that strategy as we go forward. So without further ado, Maia, it is my great pleasure to have you join us, and I thank Julia for all of the coordination and linking up from making the connections. But Maia is one of the WHO technical and implementation consultants who's supporting lived experience work in the WHO Global Coordination Mechanism on the prevention and control of non-communicable diseases. So we noted here in our catch-up that Maia has a long-standing history of advocacy roles and lived experience that you are bringing to all of this conversation as well. And we just want to recognise and thank you for bringing that, and thank you for sharing all of your time today. We won't go through the bio word for word, pop that into the chat, or you can check out the flyer again on the platform if you need to hear more. But I know that Maia's going to share a little bit more about who she is, and that she joined the World Health Organization in February for this role, but had a long-standing history with the organisation around perspectives on civil society. So let's give Maia a big warm clap and welcome virtually on our screens. I'll stop sharing, and we look forward to your tour through meaningful engagement, Maia. So thank you very much for joining us all.
Thank you so much, and it really is an honor to be here and to it's such impressive work that the center is doing, and we really appreciate being part of a conversation. I will put up the slides. Just as a caveat, I am finishing up with a cold, so I am hoping to have a strong voice throughout, but if I need to grab some water, just as a heads up. So I will mostly be talking about WHO's efforts around developing the WHO framework for meaningful engagement of people living with NCDs, mental health and neurological conditions. I am going to bring some of my experience in civil society and work as a lived experience advocate, as well as supporting platforms for more inclusive engagement, particularly in lowest income countries as well, and really try to do a little bit of both. Before I start, I do want to, I'm not based in Australia, and so I'd like to acknowledge the Massachusetts and Wampanoag people who are the traditional custodians of the land that I am in, and to pay respect to elders, both past and present, and Indigenous people present. I was going to start with my story and lived experience, and I think, I mean, you can certainly read my bio, but in a lot of ways, my life and lived experience feels very linear. I am a cancer survivor and someone living with a severe immune deficiency disorder. I was diagnosed at 21 when I was in university studying public health and global health, and interested in a career in this space. I then became involved in work around access to cancer care and NCD services, particularly in low-income countries, through grad school, through work with organizations like Global Oncology and Partners in Health, and through my experiences and other people on our team. It's pretty easy to find someone around you who has been impacted, either themselves or family members, by chronic illness. Really kind of wanted to build that into the work that we were doing in healthcare service delivery with an organization like Partners in Health, and to have lived experience and platforms for sharing the stories of people impacted by severe chronic illness, particularly in lowest income countries, which wasn't always a part of the global agenda around NCDs. And from there, kind of got involved in some of the civil society efforts around meaningful engagement, wanted to then do something a little bit more sustainable and long-standing, and developed a leadership fellowship for people with lived experience in experiencing chronic illness in settings of poverty, and really trying to break down some of the barriers to entry for advocates from countries that don't always have access to opportunities and have often been silenced in the global conversation. And that was all happening as the WHO framework for meaningful engagement was being developed. And so our advocates got to work through that process and really be a part of a small cohort of NGOs and civil society organizations that was supporting WHO through this big, ambitious endeavor. So in many cases, kind of my involvement, both as a lived experience advocate and kind of professionally through this work in civil society engagement in the global NCD agenda, is very linear. Lived experience is a lot messier than that, and I think it wasn't immediately obvious as I was a student studying global health. Global health in the 2000s was about infectious disease, and the work around chronic illness and cancer was really just emerging, and so it took me longer than it should to really realize the disparities within chronic illness. And it wasn't until I was living and working in Northern Cameroon that I really had to sort of confront the differences in my experience, where I knew where I was going to be on the 95% survival rate for the form of Hodgkin's lymphoma that I was diagnosed with. Whereas I think there are parts of where I was working where Burkitt's lymphoma or similar conditions can be death sentences, and just the absolute inequality and devastation of that of the way that global structures are set up. It's a lot. There's a lot that we share, but there is so much inequity. And so I think both that is in the outcomes and in the access to healthcare, but it is also in terms of access to advocacy. And I think as I started with Partners in Health, really was focused on providing platforms to provide platforms for other people to tell their stories, for communities that haven't had those opportunities. In 2017, when the Affordable Care Act in the United States was under threat by the Republican side of our political leadership, it was the first time that sort of friends and colleagues really encouraged me to tell my story and to get involved as a lived experience advocate in my own right. And I think it was another example of sort of, there were so many more resources that I had to work within those spaces. And so it was another moment to really recommit to addressing some of the gaps within advocacy itself. There's a photo in this slide where speaking at the UN, because we had one of our advocates from Haiti who was supposed to give that statement, sharing his experiences living with rheumatic heart disease, and his visa wasn't able to come through to make it to New York. And so kind of those dichotomies of internet access, visa, language barriers, translation, I think for a lot of people operating in global health from kind of perspectives like mine, paid employment where it's a volunteer experience, or it can be extracurricular for a lot of our friends and colleagues in other countries. And so I think within lived experience, really sort of understanding the ways in which barriers to entry can impact who gets to come to the table and who gets to really have kind of their full foot forward as a lived experience advocate has certainly been something that has influenced the ways in which I have operated as a lived experience advocate, but also trying to be part of initiatives and programs that are trying to address some of those barriers. And so before I talk a little bit more about the WHO work, just some of my reflections from civil society, and many of this will be mirrored in some of the reflections on behalf of the WHO as I get to that part of the presentation. But there's such endless energy, enthusiasm, and expertise among lived experience communities. I've mostly been operating in global NCD advocacy and among communities impacted by chronic illness, but certainly I've seen so much out of mental health lived experience advocates and really just leading the way. And it's a shared understanding, regardless of country, regardless of condition, of not only the ways in which that can impact you medically, but how it structures your life and impacts so many parts of your world outside of the illness journey itself. I think one of the themes through this presentation and that I was just talking about is there are really frustrating gaps in opportunity between advocacy and advocates in high-income countries and low-income countries. That was what I was working on day to day. I certainly don't mean to discount disparities within countries. I think whether it's Kenya or the US, there there are also barriers to entry for rural and marginalized populations within countries. And so really thinking not just about access to care or access to prevention and thinking about global equity in that way, but looking at lived experience advocacy itself and trying to address some of those power asymmetries. I think this is probably consistent with WHO as it was where I was working in NGOs, but academic medical culture in many ways helps prop up some of those inequities. It's kind of the hierarchies and just the importance of letters behind your name can be antithetical to some of the participatory approaches that respect people with lived experience as equal contributors. And so really kind of grappling with one of the things we did with the fellowship was ensure that the 4 fellows were part of the steering committee for the organization that the fellowship sat within, with the NCDI Poverty Network, and it was a challenge and a consistent process to really encourage the other steering committee members that they sat alongside, that the 4 fellows, the 4 lived experience practitioners were steering committee members. They weren't, the fellows alongside the process. And so really just continuing to sort of open up a new culture around the importance of lived experience as commensurate expertise. I think a lot of the work that we were doing was about pushing the global NCD agenda itself. For a long time, the sort of definitions of NCDs was centered around cancer, cardiovascular disease, respiratory conditions, and diabetes, and really looking at risk factor prevention, lifestyle risk factor prevention around exercise, diet, tobacco use, alcohol use, which is very central to the work, but it was narrowing in the sense that there are so many people living with conditions that are outside of those paradigms, particularly in lowest income countries. There's been some really impressive efforts with WHO to expand out the way that we think about the global NCD agenda, so that it is the global NCD mental health and neurological condition agenda. It's looking at other risk factors and other ways in which prevention is relevant, but also kind of creating space for communities, conditions like sickle cell disease, where there isn't necessarily it is a congenital condition, and there needs to be sort of space for a focus on treatment access. But I think as that agenda has been expanded, I think thinking about then what are the common narratives, and if it's not only about cardiometabolic risk factors, how do we build common space for lived experience communities to work in solidarity around access to care, around stigma and discrimination, around different aspects of the global agenda. And I think that's been work that's been really exciting to be a part of. It's not always simple. And then I think something I'm going to be talking about quite a bit is in order to formalize meaningful engagement and institutionalize it, there's a lot of nitty-gritty logistics to that. Some of the barriers to entry is around having translation available in in-person meetings, or it's been appealing visa denials, or trying to set up contracts that are inclusive of people with non-traditional educational backgrounds who have all of the requisite qualifications as far as lived experience, expertise, kind of getting into some of the institutional challenges and really kind of continuing to have the patience and perseverance to work through those different layers of what creates a supportive environment for lived experience engagement, and for it to, not be one-off, not be tokenistic, and really be integrated into every level of an organization, and whether that's at research level or program implementation. The WHO framework for meaningful engagement of people living with non-communicable diseases, mental health, and neurological conditions, it's been a really kind of big stepping stone, a milestone for WHO. It was something that I was able to be a part of the co-design process from civil society, and now it's been a real honor to be able to work with the team to steward forward the framework. It is a technical resource and set of guidelines for WHO and member state governments, ministries of health, around how to operationalize participatory structures and to really build in those inclusive principles around the way in which policy is designed, programs are implemented, and certainly research is conducted. It's kind of all centered in the idea that the right to participate is an essential part of the right to the highest attainable standard of health, per the WHO Constitution, and that those sorts of ideals around social justice, around equity, around addressing power imbalances are really embedded, as well as recognizing WHO's role as, in many ways, upholding some of those power asymmetries, and what role and what commitments does WHO need to make to change the culture and change the way in which so many of the most important policies impacting people's health has been designed without people with lived experience. And so really kind of it's an exciting way in which WHO is committing to balancing the scales, so to speak, and prioritizing people with lived and living experience, civil society perspectives, marginalized perspectives, qualitative data, and really recognizing lived experience as expertise, kind of commensurate to some of the more traditional ways in which we've valued things in the development of global policies, Ministry of Health and national led policies, programs, and services. All of the WHO framework was a 3-year co-designed process, a series of consultations, participatory activities over quite a period of time. It was a really impressive set of efforts across all WHO regions, including WIPRO, of course. It started with a global consultation in December of 2020, and then went through kind of various iterations of participatory research and participatory activities, co-design workshops, consultations, to develop the framework itself. It also inspired the publication of a series of other resources that are available. People Power is a report that uses the personal narratives of 12 individuals to highlight some of the key themes that had been raised and identified from lived experience advocates and people who are part of this consultative process. Regional Reflections is a report that breaks down some of the analysis that was developed out of regional consultations that were held in every WHO region, which both kind of set some of the common themes that became pillars of the WHO framework, but also provided a really robust space to develop some of the specific priorities particular to different regions and communities and contexts specific to different parts of the world. And so every region had different kind of priority populations that they really wanted to make sure didn't get left behind, issues that were specific to their region. And so that's also a really rich resource to take a look at. There was also a set of documentary films made of individuals' experiences from different communities and different parts of the world, as well as various co-design efforts throughout the process. The framework itself is structured in two parts. The first part is really establishing the why of meaningful engagement. I don't know that this is necessarily an audience that I have to make that argument to. I think I'm probably preaching to the choir a little bit, but it really kind of gets into some of this discussion and acknowledgement of power, discrimination, health inequity, some of the origins of really strong participatory approaches in global public health. There's a lot of lessons learned from the HIV community, from disability rights, from mental health. I think having been on more of the sort of NCD side of the global NCD and mental health agenda, kind of NCD and chronic illness communities really had a lot to learn from some of the really incredible legacies of work that has moved forward in mental health, and looking at kind of different participatory approaches. So there's some really rich kind of discussion and analysis, and really establishing for people who are newer to these sorts of ideas why participatory approaches are so important. Also breaks down, again, some things that might not be so unfamiliar to this audience, but principles around person-first language, around how, around just some of those principles around equity and the way in which people impacted by these conditions want to be considered and considered as people, and not their conditions. The second part of the framework breaks down some of the guidance for WHO and for member state governments through the co-design process and through all of the consultations with individuals with lived experience. There were 11 principles and enablers that were identified, kind of principles around dignity and respect, power and equity, inclusivity and intersectionality, commitment and transparency, institutionalization and contextualization, which was really identified as essential pillars to really move forward within meaningful engagement. And the enablers and recommended actions that match the enablers are a little bit more about sort of the how of moving some of these approaches forward. Sustainable financing is needed, both to kind of compensate lived experience expertise commensurate to the ways that we value other types of expertise, but also sustainable financing in the support to programs and initiatives that are advancing participatory approaches and that institutionalization, redistributing power, building safe spaces, really kind of that critical reflection and critical allyship within organizations to create the space for meaningful engagement and to really prioritize the voices and engagement of communities that have been silenced in the past or marginalized or not had the same space at the table. Elimination of stigma, both through legal mandates from kind of person first language. There's all sorts of different ways to address that. Integrated approaches from the integration across agendas, but also having meaningful engagement integrated within every step of the process of an organization so that people with lived experience are from the very beginning part of the decision-making process, policy and development, design, implementation, monitoring of policies and programs, capacity building, both from the perspective of, mentorship training, health literacy, setting people up for success as lived experience advocates, but also thinking about capacity building at institutional level to really, again, build that culture and to have more capacity among organizations to set up processes that aren't falling into the traps of tokenism or some of the, the pitfalls of this work. And I think that pairs really nicely with institutionalizing engagement of, all that nitty gritty of building it into systems and processes at an institutional level, whether that's the way a Ministry of Health operates or it's, WHO itself or lessons for civil society. I think another aspect of the framework is a phased approach, and so it allows member states to really kind of look at where they are between bronze, silver, and gold, and think about this as an iterative approach and something that kind of a constant work is needed to kind of move along that scale and to give a more sort of feasible approach for member states. This is just underscoring how interconnected all of these different principles and enablers are, and the way in which it's very much seen as a web within our work. The framework itself is co-designed by people with lived experience. It's also rich with perspectives and resources, and so it really is worth a read if you have some time. I'll move quickly through kind of where we are as WHO and what our next steps are, because I really do want to make sure there's time for discussion. But this is a busy slide. It's basically to say we are kind of moving from the middle dot. The first diamond was very much where the consultation and co-design process was. The framework itself was launched in May of this year of 2023. And now we're really moving as WHO into implementation, continuing to work with institutional champions kind of across all sectors and stakeholders, but working with countries and regions on implementation, thinking about the ways in which some of the guidance is contextualized and adapted depending on region, and then continuing to support the evidence base for meaningful engagement. Some of the things that we're doing on global leadership and evidence base, there will be a series of symposium in the next year and a half leading into the 2025 high-level meeting on NCDs that will really kind of provide a platform for people living with NCDs, mental health, and neurological conditions to be an integral part of the political process leading up to the next major global milestone in NCD policy. Doing lots of messy internal work within WHO I won't spend a ton of time on, to kind of build platforms institutionally within our own work to have kind of consultants and contributors compensated for their contributions to developing the evidence base and to be part of the decision-making process within the WHO global coordination mechanism and our formal processes within WHO. And then there's some exciting research that we've been working on in gray literature. We will be developing a series of publications similar to some of the other reports I mentioned that are analyzing the operationalization of meaningful engagement and analyzing some of the successes and challenges of country-level projects, both with non-state actors and civil society, which is the report we're working on this year. We'll do another spotlight on examples from member states and government level in 2024. We're also working with the British Medical Journal on a research collection around the power of lived experience with 8 articles, all led by lived experience authors in different parts of the larger community. At regional and country level, we are working with our first regional office on implementation of the framework in the Eastern Mediterranean region across the Middle East and North Africa. It is a focus on cancer, but is really intended to be a template across NCDs and mental health and provide a lot of lessons learned and an opportunity for technical exchange across all regions and agendas, and hopefully be something that other regional offices can move forward. Some of that will be in scoping reviews and in dialogues to sort of set the action plan for the implementation of meaningful engagement and institutionalized participatory approaches within AMRO's work in cancer and NCDs, and have lived experience at the center of that work. Of course, also doing sort of similar lighter touch efforts in other regions, preparing for future implementation elsewhere to really align research areas and policy priorities around the next steps that each of the regional offices want to take with the framework. Despite some of my experience being primarily an NCD, the work itself has been very kind of dispersed across NCDs, mental health and neurological conditions. There's some really exciting spotlights on stakeholders doing incredible mental health work in lived experience in the promising practices reports. We have an Australian lead author writing one of the pieces in the BMJ collection around oppression in the LGBTQI plus community. Certainly will be targeting kind of strong participation. There's so much to learn and so much, there's been so much collaboration and energy from mental health lived experience advocates, and we hope to continue that through some of these global leadership related work with the symposium, as well as lots to learn from EMRO. The EMRO policy brief efforts alongside the implementation has been focused on mental health and really looking at stigma in particular. And so that's been really exciting to continue to work closely with the mental health team alongside some of the other project focus around cancer. And then I think there's plans in the works. Many member states are really excited about meaningful engagement, but a lot of ministries of health and a lot of stakeholders haven't really taken on implementation of anything or at the scale that the framework really calls people to action on. And so I think there's a lot of interest in continuing to either, whether it's, technical exchange and a webinar series like this, or it's more like a toolkit of providing more support and guidance and capacity building for ministries of health, member states, and WHO teams around kind of what to consider in that nitty-gritty around how to do meaningful engagement. With my WHO hat on, I'll close on just some quick reflections. A lot of it echoes some of my civil society reflections. I think there's really promising signs of commitment across WHO member states and kind of everyone involved through the development of the framework, but that certainly needs to be matched in implementation. And implementation is where things get hard. And I think we are having some really exciting, challenging, open conversations with teams within WHO who are rolling their sleeves up. They're getting into the work, and there are challenges popping up along the way. And so how to continue to break that down within a very bureaucratic, very kind of hierarchical organization like WHO, and really, to the second point, unpacking and addressing some of those inequities trying to do avoid tokenistic approaches and stigma, and it's really challenging. I think we are, running up against issues where educational requirements are sometimes a barrier to move things forward within WHO systems, or trying to make sure that meetings are interactive and not just another consultation or not just another meeting, and kind of that nitty-gritty is where a lot of the work, the challenges arise, the work gets hard, but it's so important. I think an overwhelming message from some of the promising practices collaborators was just get started and crack on, do the work, and have that honesty, the open-mindedness, the reflection, the willingness to be vulnerable, certainly as an individual, but also as an organization of this, we're all in this together and trying to figure out how to move forward through these complicated bureaucratic systems. And so, there's much more work to do to formalizing meaningful engagement. Nitty-gritty logistics are as inherent to an organization like WHO as it is on civil society. And then I think the last part, this is preaching to a choir with this particular audience, but I think we need to have more acceptance of lived experience as expertise and as evidence. I think where we see the sorts of patterns of lived experiences is so important, and that qualitative perspective is so important, but where's the real data, or where's the it needs to sit alongside. And so trying to sort of continue to interrogate some of those biases. And I think the other thing that our team in particular has been an exciting challenge is, not only looking at the evidence base for how to design the processes of co-design and participatory approaches, but trying to sort of build monitoring and evaluation such that, not only how can it impact the process, but looking at the ways in which meaningful engagement can potentially, hopefully positively impact health outcomes, policy outcomes, and those sort of downstream impacts of participatory approaches, and kind of how do you look at evidence base from that perspective, as well as the really important sort of process oriented reflections and knowledge around kind of how to equitably develop the approaches, but then what is the ultimate impact of that type of work, and what role can WHO have in that type of evidence generation. And so
Maia,
I stop there. We're up on time. I know you want to do questions. That was the end, I promise.
Oh, I just noticed there are